Hi there, folks. Welcome to Storytime Live. I'm Dr. Jennifer Bird. I am a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in biblical texts. I care about that because I care about people's well-being, and I like to help other people find their way from being overwhelmed by it or being ruled by it in unhealthy ways. I like to help people with that. So I care about what I refer to as the materiality of texts. That's what I am very interested in, care about, and talk about a lot on this channel. And so what we're doing today is I'm bringing on a colleague, a biblical scholar colleague. Her name is Erin Runions, and I'll introduce you here in just a second. But I just want to remind people of why I'm doing these interviews. And the main reason is that there are a handful of biblical scholars who are doing public scholarship, and it's great, right? It's really lovely. I think it's very important, and I appreciate all the things that people are doing. But there are also just so many other biblical scholars who are doing critical scholarship that does feed into the same kinds of awareness raising, essentially, that those of us doing public scholarship are trying to do. So these conversations with scholars, from my perspective, are about bringing some more fodder, if you will, right, to the conversation or to the table for you to be aware of. And so having these conversations with people who spend their time doing really heavy mental lifting, right? Having conversations with them is my attempt to expose you to more options, more ideas, increase your own awareness of what is happening in biblical studies, whether or not you're interested in reading the works that these scholars are writing, because they are writing for the academy to help broaden the field. You might be interested in some of the scholarship that informed them. So if you're kind of jiving with one of the scholars that I interview, then you might also be interested in the works that influenced them early on, for instance, right? So that's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm talking with people about their story, talking about what influenced them or helped shape their voice, and then talking about some of the work and why they do the work they do. That's where I'm trying to focus these conversations. So to that end, I am delighted to have a conversation today with Erin in front of you all so that you can hear what's going on, hear our conversation. And she is a full professor. She's Nancy M. Lyon Professor of Biblical History and Literature at Pomona College. Just reading from her website at this point. So her research focuses on the Hebrew Bible and its reception history, how people have interpreted over the centuries, and therefore, to a certain extent, how communities have inherited the way to interpret these texts, although it's not a direct line. But anyway, with special attention to the influence of the Bible on contemporary culture and politics. And this is the book that I have in the thumbnail in particular is that's what she's up to there. In her work, she demonstrates the cumulative effect of biblical reception on, and I know these are topics that you all care about, sexuality, biopolitics, racialization, governance, war, torture, and US imperialism. So if you're interested in a pretty meaty read, engaging those topics, I would highly recommend her. It's not her most recent work, but it's her book called The Babylon Complex, Theopolitical Fantasies of War, Sex, and Sovereignty. That was printed in 2014. But her earlier works, How Hysterical, Identification and Resistance in the Bible and Film. So some fun things and ideas to play with there. Changing Subjects, Gender, Nation, Future, in Micah. So she's a Hebrew Bible scholar. So she's also been an activist for many years, working on issues of police brutality and prison injustice. There's a piece of hers that's for a general audience that I consistently taught. I asked my undergraduates in a hermeneutics class to read. Prison injustice, globalization, anti-war activism, feminist and queer organizing. And she currently helps facilitate a writing workshop inside a woman's prison and is working on issues of environmental justice in the nearby city of Pomona. So all of that is in the description as well. Thank you all for being here with us. And let me bring Erin onto the stage. or whatever you call this. I don't something into our midst. So, Erin, thank you for being here. It means a lot to me.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. And I'll just tell people who are here, I think we met at the International SBL in 2006. And I remember just thinking it was the coolest thing ever that I was on a panel with you and Joe. I just thought I thought it was such an honor to me to be be presenting with you. Anyway, and then you reached out and befriended me in a very kind way in the midst of all that. So we've known each other for a while. It's part of what I'm trying to get at. 18 years.
Wow.
I know, right?
Time flies.
Time flies, and we take interesting paths right through our careers. So,
for sure.
Yeah. You're doing some really important, heavy work, and you come from a place personally that I think a lot of people here can relate to. So, whatever about your upbringing, your background that you'd like to share would be great to let others know why you got into the work you're doing. That would be, I'm just going to, pass it off to you.
Yeah, I grew up in a really conservative evangelical family in Canada. So their conservative means a little less conservative than
right
than here.
A little more laid back. Yeah.
That church had women deacons, but didn't allow women to preach, that kind of level of conservative. And my family was very devout, and we read the Bible every morning at breakfast, the book of Proverbs.
Oh, like the proverb of the day kind of thing?
Well, just the book of Proverbs. We'd read through it and, talk about Protestant work ethic being instilled. Yeah. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you.
Wow. Yeah.
So, and then in the evening we read other passages that kind of rotated around.
Wow. Yeah. So morning and evening readings as a family. Yeah. That's a pretty serious level. I'm just going to say.
I know. It's kind of amazing when you think about it.
Right.
And for my whole upbringing, it didn't change. There was never oh, we don't need to do this anymore. I think we stopped reading Proverbs every day and maybe rotated a bit. But yeah, so that level of what was called Bible time, especially when we were little. I have a lot of jokes about Bible time now, when all the animals get up on the couch. I have, 3 dogs, and for a while I had a cat as well. And we'd all be on the couch. I'd be like, Bible time.
Everybody's together, the whole family. I'm pausing to reflect on this. I did not know this about you until I saw it in the email, and I hadn't processed it. Your whole upbringing.
Yes. So it's not super surprising that I'm a biblical scholar, although I did not intend it in any way. My undergraduate was in music. I wanted to be a musician. And then after my undergraduate degree, I thought I would, I don't know, you're changing, you're thinking. I thought maybe I would do some ministry. And then people were like, you can't just do ministry without further study. So then I went to a master's program where I learned Hebrew and Greek, and started really enjoying the process of reading the texts in the original language. And in particular, Hebrew, I really loved, and I loved the poetry, and I loved what you could see in the poetry that you could not see in English. I loved the ambiguities that emerged, and the possibilities for interpretation that I hadn't been able to see before, because, I had these fairly, strict controls around interpretation in various scenarios, family and church and youth group.
Right. And this translation is it, right? That added only one works and is proper or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So I, at some point during that master's degree, somebody said, hey, you could do a PhD. And I was like, okay, PhD. that sounds good. And at that point I was working, literally my path is very strange, but at that point I was working at AIDS Vancouver, an AIDS service organization. And I was a young woman in most people were older than me, and I felt patronized a lot. And I saw someone there who had a PhD, and I was like, nobody patronizes him. So it's like, I think a PhD would just be good, because then people wouldn't patronize me anymore. And that was like kind of
was part of your reasoning. I love it.
Yeah. So people recommended McGill. I had a friend who was doing a master's at McGill, Fiona Black, who's also a biblical scholar. And so I went to McGill. I thought I would do theology, but I was taking Hebrew, and I really liked the professor, and he suggested I do Hebrew Bible. And I had no plans to be a professor. I had no plans to, have a career. I just, McGill tuition was cheap, and it was Montreal's a fun place to live. And I thought, oh, this will be good. Yeah. This will
for what it is.
Yeah. And then, one thing led to another, and I became very intellectually engaged, and
very much so. Yeah. That's interesting. I thank you for that. I didn't know your story kind of unintentionally got here. It was just pursuing what you were interested in. It's what it sounds like, and just following that. And here we go. Right.
Yeah. At some point I decided, I made choices, and I decided to, and people would say, hey, you should apply for a grant, or you should do this, or, and so at some point I invested.
Right. Yeah. But the initial, path to the PhD. It's interesting how many people have said that, actually, who've come out, just, even Adele, or, I'm just like, oh, this is interesting. How many people just kind of, I'm just following my interests here, and here we go.
Right. Right.
So, okay. So you get through PhD, you had a fairly conservative start with MDiv as well. And then you switched and you shift over to McGill, probably opened up some things when you get into PhD graduate work as compared to conservative MDiv.
Yes, a lot of things. I mean, I was going through personal changes and personal questioning during the MDiv, and my work at AIDS Vancouver really, I said I was patronized, but I also learned a ton, and my worldview was I bet. Changed 100 million%. So, things were changing for me. And so by the time I got, in the MDiv, for instance, I remember somebody coming up to me and saying, hey, do you want to join a feminist group? And I was like, no, why do I need feminism? It's so shocking.
You meant that too.
And then I was like, in that period, I started to see, these, because I was, school in MDiv, conservative MDiv, it's highly masculine. Right. And these guys were just like very, all kinds of microaggressions, all kinds of like assumptions. And so, during that period, I started, and with the help of this person, she was really kind of helped me open up my eyes. I remember going for a walk with her, and she, explained feminism to me. And, so little did I know, but right. So during that period, I was having, then the work with AIDS Vancouver, of course, all the female identified people there were feminist, and so everything, and queer friendly, and so everything was changing at that time for me, and I really was kind of pulled between two worlds. So by the time I got to McGill, there was none of that community that kind of held me in place. I was able to explore things differently, and I was able to continue pursuing new ways of reading, which I had started, in Vancouver, but so that's kind of the path. So really the intellectual transformation, even though it was prepared by close reading in the MDiv, even though it was, developed over my whole childhood to be realistic. Right. The close reading was there, but then reading in Hebrew with the scholarly, apparatus, again, that had started in the MDiv, and then what was the real gift in McGill was talking with Robert Cully, who is my PhD supervisor. I was working on Isaiah 52, and I was like, oh, these interpretations, it's so boring. Like, is there nothing to be done here? Like, where is the attention to the language? I was reading theory about language. I was reading all kinds of things. And he said, go read Samea, which is it has become Samea Studies, but it was a journal. And it had all these different kinds of, as you know, different modes of interpretation and different themes for each issue about, reading with the trickster or reading with deconstruction or, and so he said, go read that. And so I sat in the library and I pulled out the issues and I just read through them.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, oh, a whole world opened up. And all kinds of theory and all kinds of approaches. And I was like, I can do anything. And Cully, Robert Cully, also said to me, you can say what you want to say. It's just how you say it and how you get there and how you support it. And so that was very amazing for me. And so I was able to apply all kinds of theory. I was able to start playing around with what, lenses, hermeneutics. So that was, very, very amazing and, challenging. Started to read feminist theory. Queer theory was just in its inception at that point, but, I was reading Judith Butler.
The shift from, kind of the gatekeeping, faith-determined ways of reading to whatever in particular lens you want to bring, which is what we're talking about when she refers to hermeneutics. We're talking about a different lens, a way of reading, thing that you're using to read with. So, So shall we talk about a little bit about some of the early influences for you? Would that be productive to do some of that? Well, the first one I have is and I'm fond of it, although I haven't read the whole series, the History of Sexuality. Thank you, Michel Foucault. And I'll just pull up the first volume. And this isn't what my cover looks like, so it doesn't really matter. But just to have something to look at while we talk. Obviously the title, The History of Sexuality. But what is it that this particular set of theoretical readings showed you that you then were also engaging as you became a biblical scholar?
So, Foucault is famous for his critique of power. He's famous for thinking about how power inflects sexuality, how the way that we think about the world, he turns everything on its head and he unpacks, he says, we think that society is saying no sex, no sex, no sex. But in fact, we've never talked about sex as much as we have, so that's his kind of, he kind of unpacks this idea and then he kind of traces, he traces a historical progression, but he's really interested in the changes, the way that we think about sexuality, and really in thinking about power as a matrix. And so this book, and also Discipline and Punish, which is another of his books, which I neglected to put on my list to you, but are really start to have us think about that power is not top down, but that people are joining power relations and that power is networked through society in all kinds of ways, and sexuality is one of these sites. And so reading Michel Foucault is an amazing experience. You're like, am I understanding? A lot of my first readings of theory was like, am I understanding this? I think this is what I get from it. But so that his way of looking at the world has really inflected much of what I do, even if I'm not always citing Foucault. I think Foucault's orientation, and it has been very formative, of course, for gender studies, for queer theory, for the way that we think about things. So,
yeah. Thank you for that explanation and description. I know that when I do talk about sex or sexuality and how people, in particular in faith communities, or however you want to talk about it for the people who track with my stuff, people are really aware and conscious of the power dynamic and the control piece that certain scripts, right, have played or have over us in terms of the way we've been taught to think. Many of us have been taught to think about sex or sexuality. So I think that piece people are going to connect with, and then all the other, that's really helpful kind of explanation there. Thank you for that. Yeah. How about, should we move on to someone else? Do you have a
maybe Judith Butler follows well from that.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if I pulled her up. It's so funny. I know Gender Trouble is the one you wanted from that.
No. Yeah, Gender Trouble is fine. Yeah. Any of hers, Undoing Gender, is good. Okay. The book that really influenced me was Bodies That Matter, but that's very difficult. It's a very difficult book to read. So if your your community is interested, I would direct to Undoing Gender, because it's a little, Gender Trouble was her first book, and she was criticized, and she changed her ideas, and she developed them in Bodies That Matter. But then over time, she kind of simplified the explanations. And I think Undoing Gender is one that is
a helpful one. A little more accessible,
easier to read.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that.
Accessible.
Yeah, I appreciate knowing that, actually. Here we go. Here's a current cover for it, Undoing Gender. I wasn't aware of the the pieces that went into this. So you've already said everything about it, probably, that's most relevant here.
No.
But
so what Butler does is she starts to think about gender as not a fixed thing. So I think now, like especially, my students, they're like, what? No, gender's not fixed. Of course, now
it's a given.
The orientation to gender has really changed. But when I was growing up, no, there were men and women. And, in a lot of conservative communities it's still the case, right? That's part of the culture wars right now. And so what Butler does is say that she borrows from linguistics, and she says, just as meanings of words come into, we know what they mean because they're repeated. So also with gender, we know what gender is because it's repeated. And that's what she calls the performative. It becomes real. It becomes the thing. It becomes performed, if you will, through the iteration of norms. And so you can change gender. However, she says, it's thing that happens, under threat. It's so easy to change gender norms, either societally or individually, because it comes with under threat, right? And we know that. We see that right now in the culture wars, right? With all the kinds of pushback and draconian laws against gender changing.
Right.
So, but what she really shows is that gender, and she's building on others like Simone de Beauvoir from the French 20th century French feminist, and she, and others like Irigaray, also the various French feminists, to say that gender is iterable. That is, it's a repetition of norms, and as such, you can slowly change those norms. And so for me, that was like really, really huge. And then I read, of course, Kate Bornstein's book, which is another one on the list that I gave you, who's transgender, early transgender writer. And that really changed my whole understanding of gender, because I grew up with a very strict ideas about gender, right? That I should behave in certain ways, that women did certain things, that men did certain things. And so, Kate Bornstein's personal reflections on what it means to change gender, I just remember having this moment of like, oh, like gender doesn't have to be at all like what I think, what I've been told it is. Now, of course, again, now it's hard to teach, there was a certain point where I was teaching Judith Butler and I looked at my class and I was like, don't know if I need to do this anymore, because you all like get it, right?
Yeah, at least for your students in particular, right?
Yeah.
Which is lovely, right?
Yes. Yeah, it is really lovely to be able to see, people having non-binary gender, having all kinds of relationships to gender, like this is huge. But I remember at the time, oh, this is really
malleable.
freeing, really freeing. So that was, these were my early steps with queer theory.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. It's so funny. In the back of my mind, I just had this thought that one of my former people that came on, I had a good flashy title, but it took us like 30 minutes to get to the topic in my thumbnail. But I was like, but this is important preliminary stuff. So I'm not going to worry about it, but we will get to talking about incarceration here shortly because it's coming up. But I just want people to hear about this. I think it's really important. Do you think Lee Edelstein would be good to discuss?
Edelman, yeah.
Sorry. Would that be good?
Yeah. So Lee Edelman, I think his book is, I want to say 2001, but so this was, I read this after or right at the end of grad school.
I think it's 2004.
Yeah. So, this was when I was an early professor, but again, what Edelman talks about is the way that life is organized around the two-parent family and the child in the service of the future. And so much of politics is focused on protecting the future for the child.
Okay. And heteronormative framework for that.
Heteronormative, right. Right. And he, a lot of the people that I was reading during grad school, they were into psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic theory, people like Jacques Lacan, Freud, of course. And so he thinks with Lacan, who's the 1950s around-ish psychoanalyst, but the idea that we don't have access to, this is like Freud's idea of the unconscious that Lacan calls the real, the thing that we don't have access to kind of flashes up. And for Edelman, that's what's queer, the thing that kind of disturbs the norms, the thing that ruptures. I
was going to say, I love the rupture idea concept.
Yeah. And so, Edelman is huge within queer theory and is always good to teach, even though it's super difficult to read, because this idea of the future being, if you think about politics, how the future is always protected for the child.
Right.
This might be a bridge to thinking about incarceration. Like, what are the norms of safety, often framed around the family, right? That are protected in various ways, in various conservative ways, various violent ways, whether that be war or incarceration or, other kinds of laws, anti same-sex marriage, movements. It's all protecting the heteronormative family and the child. And so, that's the rhetoric. And
right.
And so, this was basically discovering queer theory from Butler to Bornstein to Edelman was so huge and freeing for me to see that, to use as a lens to read the text, to think through the way the text gets received, to come back to the idea of reception history, right? To see how the text is used in service of certain political ends, and how the rhetoric lines up with these various things, and how these theorists can help us to unpack that.
Right.
Was just very life affirming.
I was just going to say,
very, yeah, it was just amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you. That's, yeah. I am thinking through what to ask you next. Do you have a sense of what you want to talk about at this point?
Yeah, I think maybe where we're going is into the incarceration stuff. So yeah, you might wonder, like, how is the gender stuff related to the incarceration?
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of this has to do also with the activism, the various kinds of activism that you mentioned at the beginning that I've been involved in, and that started in grad school and continued. And so starting to understand prisons as not as a site of norms, as a kind of space where all that doesn't fit the norms of society gets warehoused.
Warehoused.
Yes. Yeah. So starting to think about that and then doing the work inside prisons and meeting people inside who are lovely, amazing, accomplished people. And all of that has, you know, kind of led me to think about, well, how is the Bible feeding into what we call the prison industrial complex? That is not just prisons, but all of the things that support prisons, police, you know, parole, all the industries that feed into prisons, all the laws, you know. And again, this is very Foucauldian, like, what is it? What are all the forms of power that are operating together, on the one hand, to produce a sense of safety for some people, and on the other hand, to end up harming others, or reducing their life chances, or causing them violence, and not supporting them. And so how do those things work together, and how does the Bible and biblical interpretation and that reception history feed into that?
Yeah. And so then the question back to you, what do you, you know, I mean, I know this is really, this is important work. It's hard work. It's intricate as well. It's a meaty book you have, right? The Babylon Complex. It's not an easy read. Do you have are there nuggets or hooks that you can offer to help people? Although I already saw some people commenting like, yeah, I get the connection here, you know, kind of in a, you know, framework, kind of the control of bodies kind of way. But do you have
other hooks? Well, so the Babylon Complex was actually focused a little bit more on war, thinking about, you know, as coming out of the, you know, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, you know, the ways that biblical interpretation, especially around Babylon, whether that be the story of Babel or the whore of Babylon, quote unquote, you know, the empire Babylon, like how those things get conflated and either to support empire or to critique empire, but depending on the rhetorical need of the moment. And so I'm trying to trace that ambiguity around Babylon. Is Babylon seen as a good thing, as a bad thing, you know, and the kinds of violence that calling something Babylon allows.
Right.
And so that's what that book does. And yeah, there's gender analysis, you know, there's the gender analysis that comes with, you know, Revelation, the deployment of the figure of Babylon as a sex worker, you know, but in these various violent ways. And so
yeah, everybody's favorite, my least favorite. I don't know how you all do it. Those of you who work with apocalyptic material, I honestly, my hat's off to you, because it just wears me out, you know? And it is because it's so extreme and intense, but then I just can't get past all the harm and sexualization of, you know, cities or empires, so that we can denounce it. And by the way, of course, it's a feminized sexual role, right? And that we're okay doing all kinds of terrible things to something because of that, you know.
Right. And so that's so much of biblical imagery can be deployed in that way, right?
Yes.
You know, all the violence toward Zion. This is it's kind of victim blaming, right? But it's an explanation. So you have to kind of take a step back and understand, like, people are trying to come to terms with how violence happened and use these really misogynist and violent images to do it. But then when that gets received over time,
exactly,
becomes normalized, right? That kind of violence, like, or those
builds
kinds of misogynist.
Yes, like building up a callus or something. Like, we don't even notice it anymore, but it's still in there in our subconscious in some way, right?
Yeah,
normalization.
Yeah. So out of the Babylon, out of that work on empire and on U.S. As an empire that also denounces other empires and uses the imagery of Babylon to kind of facilitate that. Out of that project, I started to think about punishment. And of course, I was doing the prison teaching. I've done work on police and prisons, since grad school.
Okay. I didn't realize you've been doing it that long. Okay.
Yeah. Well, there were some breaks in there, but
sure. 20 years of more than 20 years of that off and on.
More than 20.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean. I didn't mean to age or date you, but I'm just saying, right? I knew that you were out before I was.
A long
finished
time.
Before I did.
So I would say about 30 by now. So so in various ways, and various protests and various kinds of iterations. And
I was just gonna say iterations of it. Sure.
Yeah, so trying to think about now the next book project that's taking a long time, but that I'm working on, is thinking about the traditions that feed into incarceration. And of course, these traditions are always gendered, they're always sexualized. Gender non-conforming people are incarcerated at higher rates than gender conforming people. And so thinking about how all of these things intersect, and thinking a lot about disposability, who's disposable and why are they disposable? And again, coming back to rhetorics of safety, rhetorics of the future, and how can we, and apocalyptic texts feed into that so well, right?
Beautifully.
We want one kind of future, and we don't want this other kind of future. And so if you just demonize a bunch of people, then you can also incarcerate them. So I've been thinking a lot about rhetorics of safety, the way that biblical texts get taken up, rhetorics of righteousness, thinking about how people can position themselves so easily against what they consider danger, how biblical texts feed into that. And really, I've been thinking a lot about how discourses around hell have been part of that, right? So I relatively recently published an article about Isaiah 66:24, which is the last verse of Isaiah.
Yeah.
The verse that talks about the rebels being burnt. There,
just take one. Hold up. Sorry, Isaiah.
Yeah, we could just read it.
Yeah,
66:24.
Because that makes it officially a story time if we actually read a text together.
Oh, there you go. Bible time.
Story time is your story, but also a biblical text, right? Yeah. All right. Is that? Everybody see that?
Yes, and they shall go out and look at the dead bodies of the people who rebelled against me, for their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh.
I don't think I realized Isaiah ended like that.
Yeah, well, a lot of Jewish communities don't read this as the final verse of Isaiah, because it is very, it's a terrible, it's a terrible verse. Christian communities, however, have really adopted this into a view of hell. Even though, as we know in the Hebrew Bible, even though many translations will translate with the word hell, there was not a developed idea of hell yet.
Yeah.
At the time that the texts were being written.
Right.
But this does seem to indicate, some eternal thing where that, depending on how you're approaching a text, could just be like hey, we really want those people to suffer,
right,
or, you know, for a long time.
right.
But then how it gets read is, oh, this is a cosmic reality. And so I started to think about this text as a text, and the way that it has grounded so much thinking about hell, and the way that those ideas about hell and about punishment have come to naturalize the painful punishment that happens in prisons. So just, you know, like you were talking about, you know, fire that won't end. Well, right now in prisons in California, where I am, the folks are dying of heat exhaustion because there's no cooling. They're not being given ice or electrolytes or cycled into cooler spaces. And so, you know, we have a literal burning of people in prisons, and people are just like, yeah, because they deserve it. Right. That this verse, it sets the groundwork for that.
Right. It's stunning. Right. And that whole the way to justify it. Yeah. Cause they deserve it, as if they have any clue what they're talking about, what people have been through, why they're anyway, yeah.
Right. What people have been through, what struggles they have, what harms they face.
Why any person should be treated that way, right?
Yeah. Right. And even if people have done something that's caused harm to other people, right? Which many folks inside have.
Right.
Does that mean that they deserve terrible pain or deserve total discomfort? And so, you know, the Supreme Court says, well, this is not real cruelty, right? This is not what we mean by cruel and unusual punishment. And the courts say that. Well, and then they say, well, yeah, suck it up. Basically, you deserve it. But I'm interested in, how does the way we think about punishment through biblical texts and through interpretations of texts, how does that affect the way we think about prisons? So to give you, can I
please?
Am I?
Yeah. 139. Are we looking at Psalm 139 or not yet?
Not yet. No, no. No, I was just going to talk about some of the reception history, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So this verse gets interpreted as being about Gehenna.
Okay.
So Gehenna is the Greek word for it actually literally translates the Hebrew Gehinnom, which is the Valley of Hinnom. And so people have thought that this verse, even though it doesn't reference the Valley of Hinnom, is referencing the Valley of Hinnom. Okay. And so therefore is a reference to Gehenna.
Gehenna, right?
Gehenna is the Greek word that Jesus uses when Jesus talks about hell, or some version of hell, that people will spend time in. You know, unbelievers will burn in Gehenna. Right. So Jesus does talk about Gehenna. So from that, though, it's very interesting to trace the history of reception on the way that Gehenna and the Valley of Hinnom are interpreted. So at first they're interpreted, and I won't bore you with all the details, but at first they're interpreted as places where idolatry happened, where there was the god Moloch was worshipped, and children were passed through the fire. Now, what that means in Hebrew, the passing through the fire, is unclear, and there's been all kinds of interpretations about that. But over time, even Jewish interpreters argued that children were burned there. Of course, that feeds into a Christian anti-Semitic idea of, you know, baby killing. You used to do this. Yeah. Right. So this is like, you know, this is already a problematic kind of framework, set of interpretations, right? That the way that Christians received that when they were interpreting hell through Gehenna. Then people in the 12th century a rabbi named Kimchi said, well, actually, people used to throw their garbage into this valley and burn it there. And so then people were like, okay, so there's garbage burning there, and then some dead bodies. And then eventually over time, and by the time we get to the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, those tend to be, those are called malefactors, and then criminals. So over time, you get this idea that criminals were burned in the Valley of Hinnom.
Wow.
And this traces back to Isaiah 66:24. And so you have this whole progression of increasingly carceral language, thinking about criminals as being burnt. And so what that does is kind of say, well, criminals deserve to be burned, right? So it erases kind of ideas of compassion or of seeing people as people
instead of essentializing around a particular act or handful, whatever, but just the essentialization of people as criminals.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So that's just one example that I've kind of been working on. Yeah. And so to think about how that all comes together.
Yeah, that's quite powerful. Thank you for that explanation.
And then I know some people are asking about sacrificing children. I don't, there's no evidence that it actually took place. So we don't actually have any evidence of children being sacrificed.
Oh, that's interesting. Even to Moloch?
In ancient times.
Yeah, even to Moloch.
Not to Moloch. No. There's no evidence of it. There is some evidence in Carthage that can be interpreted, Carthage in Africa, that can be interpreted as possible, like little urns with the ashes of children.
Okay, but that
some people have said that's baby sacrificing, but it could be lots of things. So I guess what I'm trying to kind of suggest here is that there's a lot of fantasizing that happens around a small text, and different pieces of the biblical text are put together to suggest. I think there's a passage in Jeremiah that maybe links Moloch to the Valley of Hinnom. But again, we don't have any detail in the biblical text beyond they passed their children through the fire. Now, some early rabbis wondered, does that mean, they jumped over the fire? Like they had to jump over the fire? Or, and so nobody knew. Nobody in the ancient world knew what that meant.
Right, like which should tell us something.
Readers. and then it just got elaborated over time as like this was a terrible
fantasy.
Yeah. And so I just wanted to be clear that we don't. I hope with that example nobody comes away thinking that I think that actually happened in the ancient world, even though there's lots of probably writing about the Bible that says that it did.
Exactly.
It's not actually, there's no physical evidence.
Justification to claim that it actually happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you that's actually a pretty significant thing to correct. Like, I don't know how many times or places I hear people, and I don't have the time to go look into it. So it's
and there's a question here that says the biblical authors and their said their political enemies did it. So why would they lie?
Yeah, so let's put this up. Said their political
yeah, so that's a good question. What they were trying to argue against was a certain form of idol worship. And so in the ancient world, it was quite normal to exaggerate.
Exactly. I was thinking there's a good reason to lie.
I don't think humans have changed, but And so I think that we just, this is part of reading, as we say, with reading between the lines, or reading with questions, or not overreading something that isn't said in the text, right? And so
little suspicion here, kind of, right? Yeah, hermeneutics is suspicion about. Yeah, I mean, thank you, Smitty. I appreciate the question or the comment, right? Because
this is a question. There's sarcasm.
Yeah. No, it's all good, right? Because that's important, right? I kind of want to make sure people understand your point, but also, We do this. People still do it, right? People still take a thing that someone has done and spin it a little bit, misinterpret it, pull it out of context, something, in order to make a big deal. And I'm not thinking of anything in particular going on currently, but, so yeah. And so the fact that it's then like we have this canonized, these examples of dehumanizing or is it an extreme? Is it exaggerated or not? Did they actually do it? We don't know. And so now it's just confusing and ambiguous, right?
Well, and to me, what's interesting is the way that various modes of interpretation over time, for different political and theological purposes, get, the reason why early Jewish readers were elaborating that text was also to condemn idolatry, whereas as it got taken up in the Christian tradition, it became increasingly vague, I guess, and yes, also condemning idolatry, but then to both malign Jews and also to malign anybody that they thought should be in hell. And then over time, as I showed, it becomes about criminals. And so for me, what's interesting is how the politics of a moment might affect a reading, but those politics get lost, or those theological stakes get lost as certain readings get taken up and changed, and the origins of it get kind of lost. And so then you get this idea that Hinnom was a place for burning garbage and bodies, the bodies of criminals. And this is fact, considered fact. It is not fact, but it's considered fact in certain Bible dictionaries. I found it in a lot of places.
Yes.
And so this is the thing that concerns me, because all that history of citation, of interpretation gets lost.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's what's exciting about reception history, I think, because what you start to see with reception history is how certain readings came to be, and all the things that get lost, where you can be like, oh, wait a minute. The Bible doesn't actually say that. Yeah.
Right. This is a total tangent, but when Lynn Huber was on, she made a comment about the island of Patmos as an alleged, political camp, political war, whatever, and I was like, yeah, I mean, I've heard it from someone I respected, and I didn't have time to look into that. She's like, yeah, there's no evidence for that either. Like, these are significant things that it helps in a certain interpretation, which happens to help my interpretation because I'm big into thinking about it as the political element. But that's a big thing that people just assume is true. It's out there, right? So this piece is a pretty significant one. And as you say, feeds into the work you are doing specifically. There's some really interesting comments in the chat that I'm not going to bring up, unless you would like to. But because I'm interested in the carceral piece, unless you want to engage what they're talking about. I don't know if you do or not.
I'm not following it all. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Every now and again, I see something and then I miss.
I know, and then it scrolls up a little bit. I do want to bring, just because this is interesting to me, I will put this up very briefly. Thank you, Kyle Pratt, Dr. McClellan, and Dr. Bowen, Josh Bowen, have talked about Molech seeming like it was a type of sacrifice rather than a god. I'm not familiar, and I haven't watched their work on that. But you said you seemed to be familiar with that, or the idea of that. Is that?
Yeah, the idea. Well, again, trying to understand what this is, right?
Right.
So Molech is actually the same word, the same root as Melech, which is king.
King, right?
And so Molech is actually one way of it translating, it is a proper name, but you could also translate it as kinging. And so some people wonder, I don't know the specifics of their argument, but what is it?
Yes.
Is it a sacrifice to a king, or is it? Yeah. So.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah. We have a few minutes left, and I don't know. I'm just going to say this now. If you all have specific questions for Erin, this would be a great time to to pose those if you haven't already. I haven't been tracking with the chat as we've gone through. I've been trying to focus on chatting with Erin, with Dr. Runions. But So maybe a few more thoughts, if you have them in you, if you have the energy to kind of put a few more things out there about, the incarceration, the role of biblical texts. This is really powerful for me, just to have this nugget. It feels like a pretty big nugget, but right, about the role that reception history has played in setting the stage for, right, this piece of utter dehumanization of people who've been convicted of crimes. And I like to try to stay away from labels because I feel like labels tend to essentialize people, and I get really frustrated with that. And I rebel against it for myself, and so I want to try to rebel against it for other people as well. So I don't know. Are there any, maybe a last one or two thoughts about the work you're doing with the Hebrew Bible in particular, I'm assuming, on this project or in this realm of conversation?
Yeah, I mean, there are also passages in the Hebrew Bible that can be read otherwise, right? There are passages in Isaiah about, breaking people out of prison. The prisoner will go free. And so I think, I don't want to, but those ones don't get, picked up in the same way, or only by some readers. But right? So I think overall, what I'm interested in is, and I am looking for counter readings for readings that, I found this memoir of a man. He was a minister who was incarcerated in the 19th century, who said prison is hell. Like prison is hell. Right? And that is something you hear folks inside say all the time.
I'm sure.
Hell. Prison is hell.
Right.
And so I'm interested in how it is that prison can operate like hell, like literally burning people, burning them to
allowing
death.
For people to be burned alive. Yeah. Not even really. Yeah. Taking a second look at that. Yeah. I met several years ago. I don't even know how long ago. I remember talking with you about Psalm 139 and the idea of always being watched, always being monitored, being a really powerful part of the incarcerated state. So I don't know if that is a big piece of that. Doesn't sound like that's front and center for you right now.
Well, not right now, but it has been. So the idea of Psalm 139, where, wherever I go, you will be, right? That God will be. And
him, you in behind him before.
Yes. And, that's supposed to be assuring.
It is.
And, it is assuring in the way that it's delivered. But when you closely read that psalm, you see there's a lot of disintegration as well. And so and so people have talked about how that psalm is somewhat ambivalent. Like, is it a good thing, the surveillance, or is it not?
Right.
And it's been used in all kinds of very interesting ways, often around assurance.
Sure.
Sometimes for pro-life, there's the whole you saw me, you were there when I was formed in the womb. There's a line like that.
In my mother's womb.
Yeah. So it gets used in all kinds of ways, which is fascinating just in and of itself.
Agreed.
But one thing that's really interesting to me, and this is again the kind of I've been working a lot in the 19th century now. So, in the 19th century there were, and I know you came to this paper when I talked about it, that there were slave catechisms, right? Where slaves were taught. And so if we think about slavery as a kind of carcerality, slaves were taught Christianity through question and answer, repetition. And Psalm 139 shows up there a lot to say God's always watching. You better be careful. God's always watching. And so, and hell also shows up a lot in those. And so, that combination, and the person writing, one of the main architects of slave catechisms, actually deliberately said, well, we don't have enough patrols right now. So if we use Christianity, we can have people patrol themselves,
monitor themselves.
And that's so Foucauldian, right? The way that power gets turned inward and we end up supporting power structures. And here Christianity is being used deliberately to do that. And I would say that happens still today in prisons, right? When there's the highest level of programming is Christian programming, and people go there with very good intent. They want to help. They want to follow Jesus' command to,
visit the prisoner and
or
love your enemy or whatever. I don't know.
Right, but again, it's kind of this idea of also the prison the prison wants docile prisoners,
right?
So
wants control.
Yeah.
He's making the list.
Yeah. Oh, I like this comment. Monotheism, universal panopticon. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you, Shimmering Surface. Anything else? I didn't see any pressing questions. I think people are just enjoying. And how about this is an interesting angle. I just saw the question. So thank you, Harris Fox Pinkham. How about Christians being okay with their loved ones being incarcerated, right, and tortured for eternity, basically in hell? That's an interesting. I mean, I think perhaps it's related, right? That if people are familiar, if people are buying into the concept of eternal hell and damnation, and you're somewhat numbed to that it does, make some space for.
What that also brings up is like, how do we handle social harm, right? What does it mean how do we handle social harm apart from prisons, and what systems are in place? And it can be very tricky and difficult. And so if family members see that their person has caused harm or has caused them harm, they want it to stop.
Right.
And so, that is one way that it stops. But it's a huge system that does harm. It isn't, and there's some rehabilitation that happens, or there's some good programming inside prisons, I want to say, as I do some educational work there, but
right.
Which we could critique as well, but I think it requires a larger societal conversation around how do we deal with social harm,
right?
How do we set up structures that don't require a kind of that can help people, support them when they've been harmed, support them if they've done harm,
right?
And so I think what you said is correct, that if the options are a kind of Christian supported idea of punishment that feeds into a carceral structure, then not everybody wants to reinvent the wheel, right? They just want the problem to stop. And so I think one of my goals in the work that I do is to kind of help people to see, well, maybe there are some other options, and maybe we can look at, options of restorative and transformative justice. Maybe we can think about other kinds of readings of biblical texts that, don't just support this. So, I think none of this is easy, and none of it's simple to figure out what to do,
to figure out, or even to put into
yeah.
practice if you do figure out something useful.
Yeah. And I mean, we all know how hard it is. We can't control people, we can't, so we all know that. And yet,
right.
How do we not just lock people up? And we know that the way that people are locked up is racialized.
Right.
It depends on economic status. There's all kinds of, as we talked about earlier, gender norms.
Yeah, especially trans, non-binary or non-typical and gendered bodies.
Yeah. So,
Thank you.
Lots to think about.
There is lots to think about. And I'm gonna, what fraction is actually stopping? Yeah, some interesting. You've certainly gotten people thinking and chatting and talking, and I imagine there's going to be a whole bunch of comments here as I wrap up saying thank you so much for this. So let me say it one more time here. I appreciate you taking some time out of the work you're doing and the kind of focus work that you're doing right now to come have a conversation with me about yourself and the things that are important to you. I appreciate it, Erin.
Yeah, well, I'm really happy to be here, and I do hope that I've clarified rather than confused.
No, it's great. Even if you've confused, it's given us things to think about. So thank you for that. Yeah. All right. I'm going to wrap it up here. Let me Oops. Thank you all for being here. For those who were able and wanted to be here live with us, I appreciate your company. I hope you found some of this conversation somehow enlightening or supportive and giving you something new to think about in terms of the ways that biblical texts play out in our collective realities. I guess I'll say for now. No, there will be no live conversation tonight. I just posted in Patreon about that. And I'll be back next week to talk about, I can't remember the topic because I think we're moving on from talking about sin. There's some important conversations people have suggested I address. So I'll look into doing that starting next week. So thanks for being here and take care.